Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Sam Dolce. I'm an attorney here at Milestone Consulting. We've, for the past 22 minutes, have been having a little bit of a scramble trying to make sure our technology is working. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have everybody on camera today. It appears that we have some firewalls in place and things of that nature. So we will be moving forward. Bridie and me will be able to be on camera. Regina may be able to join us in a bit. And Dr. McGuire is already on by phone, and I believe Regina is joining by phone in a moment as well. So I just kind of wanted to do some basic housekeeping. I did include a little welcome message in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to access that and ask them there. We'll answer and leave 15 minutes for questions at the end. At any time during the webinar, feel free to drop a question in that little box. We'll answer them at the end, but don't just save them for that time. Feel free to ask them as they come up. I do want to introduce our panelists today. I'll start with Bridie. She's a former 3-time American record-holding speed skater and leading advocate for child sex abuse survivors. She was abused herself at the age of 15 by her then 33-year-old speed skating teammate. Bridie's worked with lawmakers to spearhead legislation in both New York and Arizona to extend the time for survivors in those states to take civil action against their abusers. Today, she's the founder and CEO of the nonprofit America Loves Kids. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Regina is the co-founding partner of Calcaterra Pollack LLP. She's a trauma-informed attorney who represents survivors of childhood sex assault. Her experience as a trauma-informed attorney is attributed to her own experience surviving childhood sexual and physical assault, which she chronicles in her New York Times bestselling memoir, Etched in Sand. And lastly, but certainly not least, Dr. Laura McGuire is the founder of the National Center for Equity and Agency. They're an internationally recognized consultant, survivor, researcher, seminarian, certified full-spectrum doula, certified sexual health educator, vinyasa, yoga instructor, and author of the book, Creating Cultures of Consent. Dr. McGuire is currently an adjunct professor at Widener University, where they teach, human sexuality courses.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I am so excited for today's presentation because it's rare that you get people of such different backgrounds who focus on the same topic together in a room at such a high level. So I know all of you are impacting the way we care for clients. And so I wanted to create this discussion, but first just kind of open up with an overarching question of what's your definition of trauma-informed care? And please keep answers brief if possible. Bridie, I'd like to start with you.
Oh, sure. So, hey everyone, it's nice. I was going to say nice to see you, but I guess it's nice to be seen. Thanks for joining. This is obviously a very important topic to me and near and dear to my heart. To kick it off with what is trauma-informed care? To me, it is folks that are in it for the right reasons, that are aware of the challenges that I've been through as a survivor and are cognizant of the challenges I'm going to have going forward. In terms of what brings us all here together, the aspect of litigation, it's having an attorney that's willing to stand up for all of those right things and recognize how hard it is for me. In terms of the financial planning after the fact, is recognizing the mixed emotions about the compensation I may be receiving, and being able to, again, give time and attention to be able to work through all those feelings and emotions.
This is Regina. Thank you, Bridie. I'm just going to add on to that. You know, as an attorney, we're not trained to address issues related to trauma. It's certainly something that is, has never been taught in law school, at least when I went to law school back in the 1990s. It may well be now. And for me, I was fortunate enough to fortunate enough to take the experience that I had and actually learn what it is to deal with folks who have trauma just by my own personal experiences. But I think most importantly, what trauma-informed care is as an attorney is to understand that your clients are coming to you, with suffering a lot of trauma. And when you suffer trauma as a child, it has been proved through something called ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, which if you're not familiar with, you should take a look at the CDC website, which actually explains what the long-term impact of trauma is. But when a child is physically or sexually abused, when as a child, as an adult, it is expected that it's going to impact their neurodevelopment. They're going to have certain types of emotional and cognitive impairment. They will have adopted some health risk behaviors, maybe smoking and drinking. They may not be college graduates. They may not be high school graduates. They may not be able to hold down a job because of the trauma that occurred to them. And as a result of that trauma, they may have repeated the cycle and sexually abused or physically abused others as well. They could have, end up in jail, incarcerated. And that is because they were never able to move past that trauma. So your clients may come to you with some challenging facts and understanding that the position that they are, as an adult, that they're there because of the trauma that occurred to them as a child is important for you to understand, because that's going to make you a better litigator, understanding that you need to take this adverse experience that they had and use that to try to get as much justice as possible for them, so they can, finally move on. But having empathy for your clients and being able to listen to them and is really what trauma-informed care is.
Thank you. That's a wonderful response. Dr. McGuire, would you mind giving us a definition as well?
Definitely. So I am fortunate that I have to answer this question almost every day of my life because I train on trauma-informed care all the time. And I do now train attorneys, and we're hoping to get into law schools and all. Just as was mentioned, this is a topic that a lot of people can use in their daily life and simply isn't offered through their academic career, much less in-depth perspective in their professional career. So what is trauma-informed care? Trauma-informed care is understanding the depth and breadth of trauma in the world around us and actively working to minimize that trauma and not re-traumatize.
Great. Thank you again so much. I am hoping that we can sort of have a conversation and let this flow naturally at a point, but I want to start it off with just a question that'll address some practicalities. As a former litigator, and I'm sure as all the litigators who are on want to know, we want tools that we can actually use. And so I'm just going to ask, is there something that you all see lawyers doing that might think is trauma-informed or a trauma-informed practice, but actually goes against some trauma-informed care principles, or you think may not be the best way to handle a client? Maybe common practice areas or just things you see people doing all the time that they could improve. And Regina, as a practitioner, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay.
As an attorney, you need to get as many facts as possible. And, it's natural to expect that you're going to be, you should be getting the facts from the survivor. But it's important to minimize the amount of time that you're asking your client to relive that trauma with you in full detail. And you may be, trying to be sympathetic and patient with them. But it's best to limit the amount of time that your client actually has to share the details with you, and rely a lot upon the documents that they're going to be providing you to put together an outline. And once you've put together that outline, then share it with the client so they can then review it and then add to it as much as possible. And by doing that, you're minimizing the amount of times you're having that conversation. You may think by, constantly speaking with them that you're trying to feel them, make them feel more comfortable with you, which is very important. But by doing that, you're also asking them to repeat a trauma that they've been carrying around their entire life. So it's you've got to balance out being, there for your clients, but also understanding that you've got to minimize the trauma that they're going through just by telling the story while they're working with you too, because you want them to be able to feel comfortable with filing the suit, but also, not get to a point where they don't want to seek justice. So you just have to balance out getting the facts, but doing your best just to rely upon all the documents that you possibly can.
That's excellent advice. What I'm hearing is the use of timelines, limiting re-traumatizing situations, like retelling their stories over and over again. Bridie, I saw you kind of shaking your head in agreement along the line. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think, well, actually, I know Regina's spot on regarding the amount of times to ask the survivor to retell the story. And I think that a lot of folks start there and have that awareness. I know that one thing that Regina does right in her practice is the idea of from what is the experience from when a survivor lands on your website. So before they even talk to you, what does that feel? And for me, I don't want to feel like I'm just another case number for you, right? And so being sensitive to how that feels as someone's going to the website. What does your the time that the lawyer spends with the client, understanding the paperwork. I mean, I know this is what you all do every single day, but we don't sue people every day. And so understanding that this is a new process. And so while being cognizant of the actual crime that we're going to discuss, but also the whole process. I mean, something as basic as I finally get the courage and I email you, Sam, and you want to make sure you follow up. So you respond to me, but you CC someone in the office just so you don't forget. It took everything I had to talk to you. Who's this new person? Right. And so like from an administrative perspective, it makes sense. But just these are different, really highly sensitive situations. And so there's every single one of those points are really, really important and need to be paid attention to.
What we did, this is Regina, I'm going to jump in with Bridie, is, we set up a protocol. It's important to set up an internal protocol and an external page, as Bridie said, that invites the survivor in and makes them feel comfortable. That clearly at the very beginning it says this is, every discussion that you're going to have is confidential, that you explain right away at the top of your website, page on this, that it's a contingency relationship, and explain that to them, to those who are reading it, what exactly that is. And when you first have a conversation with the survivor, it is important that whoever is doing the vetting has a specific protocol. And what I would recommend to attorneys out there is set up your internal protocol for the first vetting, and set up your webpage in consultation with a survivor who is not a lawyer, so they can take a look at it and give you guidance on what it should look like and what your protocol should be and the questions that you ask initially, so you get an understanding of what it is that's going to would potentially scare away somebody by what it is that they're reading. And what Bridie said is critically important internally, is that never include, once you have your first conversation with the survivor, if that person is a non-lawyer, and most often it may be, our paralegal is, she's having conversations almost every other day with a survivor that's contacting us. Sometimes it takes several hours to do so, and in order to get the initial information that is there. But then there is a point when the survivor is going to speak to a lawyer Make sure it's only one lawyer on the phone, or at the most two with the paralegal. You want that first person who had that conversation with her, because the survivor may say, well, I told it, I mean, Izzy is our paralegal. I told Izzy that. So you want to make sure that that person is on the call as well, but limit the amount of lawyers and limit the amount of people that are on the call beyond the initial intake person, and maybe with a lawyer. And again, like Bridie said, do not include others on an email as well, because I mean, I not only have had this, incident with, where we try to avoid that with, sexual assault survivors, but also, other families that we represent who have suffered trauma in different capacities too. As soon as there's a new name on there, or they're being introduced to a new person, they do ask who they are. And we have made a mistake in the past where, a staff member left and replaced it by somebody else, and we didn't tell them. And they were upset because they don't know who it is that this person is and why they're actually calling them. So just make sure there's a very straightforward discipline and protocol that's set up, and to minimize the amount of people who are contacting them.
Dr. McGuire, would you like to contribute on that? But I also have another specific question I'd like to ask you as well.
Absolutely. So your first question being, what do a lot of attorneys and just people who are in the legal sphere, right? So that can be paralegals, mediators, et cetera, do that seems to be standard protocol for them, but maybe is lacking in trauma-informed care. And I think one of the biggest things comes down to what they would experience as common policy and procedure and kind of flow for the case, and giving the client the information as to updates or checking in on them, or needing to go over something that's just come in, and having this emotional disconnect from that, because for them it is just an everyday practice and something that they're going through. And for the survivor, that's something that is coming into their daily life and often bringing up all of those triggers from their trauma and all of the what ifs, especially when they're reading something. A lot of it's in legalese, right? And it's not in everyday vernacular and language. And so that is incredibly stressful and scary. I think another piece of this is making sure that people understand, well, then what does that alternative look like? And I know, Sam, we talked about this when I was training with your staff, giving some examples. Well, here's a trauma-informed text message. Here's a trauma-informed email message versus one that you would commonly see lawyers giving their clients, but that again could be re-traumatizing them. And then for the attorney, there's going to be that frustration. Well, they're shutting down. I'm not getting a clear story. They disappeared. I don't know where they even went. I guess we're not working on their case anymore. And it's simply because there's that lack of understanding of how the traumatized brain is experiencing that information and those impacts. When we've gone through trauma, especially when it's acute or long-term, we're going to see this experience of hypervigilance come up whenever there's something that brings up a memory of that trauma. So again, they get an email saying, oh, please see attached, there's been something new filed in your case, and their brain goes into hypervigilance mode. And we also see that in the examples of having someone else CC'd. What's going on? Who's trying to hurt me? I'm under attack. Right? A lot of times they're getting that in the middle of having to take care of family or at work. And now their family and their coworkers are wondering what's going on with them, right? And so having those examples, walking people through this kind of education, the great news is it's very cost effective, right? It's really about changing the lens, changing the paradigm that you're approaching people from. You don't have to buy software or a new gadget, but you do have to have that foundational and in-depth information on what does this look like? How is someone going to be experiencing this? And how do you get the best outcome for everyone involved?
Excellent. Thank you so much. My next question is sort of a follow-up to that. And that's, could you kind of provide a professional success story where you have seen something that you did in a trauma-informed way that positively impacted a client? I'm talking about a real-world example of something that you either do at your firm, or you've done in a training, or you've done while talking to a claimant, and ways that you were able to positively impact their trajectory through a trauma-informed practice?
Yes, absolutely. So it's funny that you mentioned that, because I can think of an example that came up this exact week where I was emailing with someone who was explaining to me a traumatic situation for them and asking for support with that. And this was something that they had to share with a couple of people outside of myself and my firm. And my response really was, again, affirming their feelings around this, connecting to it as a survivor and someone who's walked that path, and making sure that they understood, I was here to support them in whatever way they needed, and that they had that right to that kind of experience, and to let me know, is there anything else they want to talk about, whether it's through email or phone, or if we want to hop on Zoom, whatever mode of communication is best for them. And that's just how I now operate, right? I've been doing this for so many years, but their response to me was, wow, that was the kindest response that I've received to this email in the dozen people I've had to send it to in this process. And that honestly really broke my heart, because it shouldn't be, right? It should just be standard. It should be, of course, I'm approached with acceptance and kindness and emotional intelligence in understanding that I'm sharing something that's very vulnerable with you. But the reality is, again, lack of awareness, lack of education leads to those negative outcomes. So yeah, I see it all the time.
Okay. Now I'll follow up on that. This is Regina Calcaterra. There's actually 2 times in this particular story I'm going to share with you that my personal experience resulted in a, I wouldn't say professional success story, but help advance a pretty brutal CVA case. I had, by way of my book, I would, travel around and I share my story about how my siblings and I grew up in and out of foster homes and homeless shelters. So I was speaking at a group called Vibes, which is a rape crisis center on Long Island. And there was a young man there who for the very first time was telling his story in public, because what Vibes does is they teach the survivor to share their story, because it takes the shame off of them and puts the blame on the perpetrator. So this is the first time he was sharing it, and it was pretty brutal, and I had to somewhat follow that, after he spoke. But I was so proud of him and gave him a hug and gave him my card and said, I'll always be here, if you ever want to talk about this. And a little while later, this was in about May, June 2019, he called me and he said, the CBA is a law that is going to give me an opportunity to sue and file a lawsuit. And then he went into detail where where it actually occurred, and I didn't realize because he didn't share the story, but it was a group home here on Long Island where there are where young men would go who are transitional, which means that they could have been incarcerated, but they were placed there. So, some of the attorneys at my firm were concerned because he was put in this transitional setting, therefore he must have done something wrong, and that could have been used against him as to why it was that he was placed there anyway. However, I understand that in the foster care system, since my siblings and I grew up in and out of it, is that when you're a teenager, no foster parents want you. So you're put in a group home. If you're 11 or 12 or 13 to 14, we are much less desirable to be placed in a family home. So teens end up being placed in a group home, even if they didn't, even if there wasn't anything that they ultimately did to, end up in the criminal justice system, because no one else would want to take him in there. Well, so I started doing a little bit digging and found out that he was placed in foster care because he was gay. His father filed a PINS because he didn't want to raise a son who was gay. So here is this 12-year-old who was put into a group home with transitional boys who were 17 years old. So understanding the foster care system and what happens to teens once they get older and why it is, they ultimately end up there. was my opportunity to not only educate my colleagues, but also give him the opportunity to file this lawsuit, which ultimately led to others coming forward too. And it was the same fact pattern with other young men who were placed there, is that there was no place else for them to go because no one would take them in, and the same things happened to them. So that was kind of like a two-step about how my personal experience not only gave me exposure to this young man, but it also, because of understanding of the foster care system and what ultimately happens, gave him representation where others may have just turned him away.
That's a wild story.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Regina.
Yeah. As far as a moment where trauma informed the success story, if you will, what's been so interesting for us at America Loves Kids is we do outreach toward the end of the New York window closing in August, and New Jersey at the end of this year, is just reaching out to as many survivors as possible and letting them know that who they're going to talk to is going to listen and is going to be there. And what has been so interesting, I found, is that while someone calls with one event in their head, they'll tell me about it. And I mean, the one person I'm thinking of specifically, she called and she said, I know I don't have the ability to file a lawsuit under CVA in New Jersey because my uncle's dead, but starts talking and she says, but it wasn't as bad as when I was raped in church by the choir director, and keeps on talking. And because I let this person have the time to talk, she had ranked her traumas, right? And called me to talk about this one. But just giving her the time to talk instead of saying, we can't help you, CVA can't help you, but giving her the time to talk and to listen to her, to hear like there's so much behind that, and that there might be a way to interface in this one capacity. In terms of the other ones, like we'll certainly send them to different organizations and resources kind of thing. But the idea that just me sitting here clearing my desk and listening and just letting that person kind of unravel what it is, instead of having an agenda and a checklist on my side, I think was really helpful for that person.
These stories are making me think of another common example too, and I'm sure that Regina and Bridie can connect with these. You know that so many times I'll be speaking to an audience even on something that isn't directly about trauma, but just bringing up that as something, you know, that we speak to often, or, you know, people hear something in passing, much less when you are speaking to professionals who are there to have a conversation about survivors. And it's always incredibly humbling to me how many people in attendance, right? They're not coming as survivors. They're not identifying as survivors, but they will take me aside at some point and say, you know, I'm here as a professional, or I'm here like having lunch at a venue and I heard something, and that I want to tell you what happened to me. And what an incredible honor that is when you start getting into this work, when you put that as a forward-facing piece of who you are as a person. How many people want to share their story with you and their pain, and hope that you maybe have additional resources for them as well. I remember one training I did, there was a woman and she had been a therapist for over 40 years. She was in her 60s, and in the middle of the training disclosed that she had memories from preschool and being sexually abused by another child. And she said, you know what's amazing is that this is the first time I've ever told this story. A therapist, you know, in her 60s and for over 50 years, there just hadn't been a venue where people were talking about this in a way that she felt supported enough to disclose and share those memories. And, you know, that is, again, understanding the depth and breadth of trauma. It is all around us all the time. people want support and resources and safe spaces to share and to support other survivors as well. But so often those are few and far between, and that's part of creating a more trauma-informed world, is increasing that.
I wanted to jump in on this for a moment again to kind of expand upon what I said earlier. For those who aren't familiar with with the foster care system, you're probably receiving calls from survivors of sexual assault where it happened in a foster care type setting. And, if it seems like if it's in a private home, that there may not be any potential liability. But, it's helpful to continue, as Bridie said, is continue having a conversation with the survivor to better understand how they actually got there, because there are there's several types of settings actually in the foster care system. But a child is placed in foster care by way of either local social services, local county agency, or a not-for-profit social service agency that contracts with the county to place the children there. So you have liability not only with the particular county, whether or not they knew or this was foreseeable, or if they had prior reports of potential abuse in that home, or the same could be, you would apply that if it was a social service agency that contracts with the county, that they may well be aware. Or if it's in a group home, like the group home that we're suing, which is the Timothy Hill Children's Center here, on Long Island, that contracted with social services to have children there. And there are also other settings that when kids get older, that they're placed, like teenagers, like I said, are placed in different settings that are more like a community-based foster care. So you should explore a little bit more about what particular home they're in. If they say foster care, what type of entity it is, to see if there is potential liability there. I just want to share that with those because there may be an institution that's liable. And trust me, social services know. I mean, I was I was placed in my last foster home, my sister and I, after they stopped placing young girls there because the foster parent was allegedly molesting younger girls that were there. So they stopped placing girls, but because we were older teenagers, they thought it was okay for us to go there. So they have those records, and those records are, still available decades ago on that particular foster family. So there is some searching to do, but you could potentially find culpability there.
Regina, thank you again for the amazing practice tips and for sharing your story. It's truly incredible. I want to ask, I know I'm focusing on practicalities, but I think it's important. So I just want to ask, what's one thing everyone watching this webinar could start doing tomorrow in their legal practice in order to make their practice more trauma-informed?
I would say go on the CDC website and look up ACEs and understand adverse childhood experiences, understand what experiences actually cause that trauma and what happens to individuals who don't get the proper counseling or have the trauma dealt with when it has actually occurred. So you understand the survivors who are calling you, and if they come to you with with what happened to them and some of the facts you may deem as inconvenient facts because they may not be favorable, you'll learn how to best take those inconvenient facts and actually use it to their advantage, because what happened to them when they were assaulted, is probably one of the reasons why it is that they may have a criminal history or things along that line. So understanding ACEs is critical, and there's a lot of material about ACEs and what trauma is actually the impact that actually has on the physical health and the mental health of adults. Take the time.
I concur that that's so extremely important. Dr. McGuire, would you mind reflecting on ACEs for all of us for a minute or two and just kind of speak to what that is? I know I've done trainings with you, so I know you've presented on this before.
Yes, the ACEs are incredible because it is the largest study of its kind conducted to this day. So it is the best information we have on the long-term impacts of childhood trauma. And it was essentially a 10-question survey that went out to thousands of people across the United States and asked them as adults what kind of experiences they had had as children that were identified as potentially traumatic, and then what situations they were currently facing, or different forms of health issues, as was mentioned, or problems with employment, et cetera, as an adult. And it's a fascinating study because some of the traumatic things that are listed in the survey are not things that people would often think could have long-term negative implications, right? So one, for example, is, did you ever feel unloved by your family and your caregivers? And a lot of people say, well, feeling unloved is, not the same thing as being hit or, being neglected in some other way. But we know that it really does have very similar, if not the exact same kind of impact on the brain. And we now can see in neuropsychology that there are victims of childhood abuse, particularly sexual and physical abuse, who have scar tissue in the brain from this kind of trauma specifically. So it helps us understand that when we're working with adults, this is not something we can say, come on, that was in the past, get over it. Or, this is something you should just be able to choose to overcome or not let bother you, right? We talk about that a lot in those educational sessions, where we really say this impacts the gray matter. We can physically see parts of the brain enlarge, the parts that are connected to fear, and parts shrink, the parts connected to emotional regulation and memory, right? So that is not subjective. That's not just, opinion-based, but that is something we can physically see impacting victims and survivors. And so I think one thing people can do in their daily life starting now is really that all of this begins with the internal work of understanding your own biases, your own limitations, on understanding survivor experiences. Part of that comes from listening to survivors. There's so many resources out there to understand their story. Another part of it comes from understanding the scholarship and, again, some of the science behind what we're talking about and how it affirms those survivor perspectives. But really it begins with doing that internal work, because if you have all the outward facing pieces, but you haven't addressed your own biases and limitations, then it's not going to be as effective. And then secondly would be really thinking about, based on that information that you've gathered in your own learning, where are the places that you need additional support and resources and training, and investing in that, not seeing it as, fluffy or something that doesn't really benefit me because, it's not something directly to do with my legal certifications, but as something that really is core to what you're practicing. And this is true not just for people who are working with survivors in criminal law, but family law, immigration, personal injury. There's so many places that we need more trauma-informed attorneys and individuals overall.
Thank you. And thanks for speaking towards ACEs and the studies a little bit as well. I appreciate that. And thank you, Regina, for bringing it up as such a good practice point. I think both those suggestions were very helpful. Bridie, do you have anything that you'd like to contribute on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of what lawyers can do tomorrow to change, to be better serving of their clients. I think Laura said it so well, is reach out to survivors and ask us how to better improve your service. And like she said, it might seem like an investment that seems soft, or like you want to put a certificate on your wall, but honestly, for someone that's going through it, it's the difference between me feeling comfortable and trusting you and not, and how to go about talking about these different topics, how to ask the questions of the survivors that you need. So I think it's being willing to listen and open up to someone and hear where your practice might be able to improve.
That's amazing. I think one time you once told me it's not whether you're trauma informed or not trauma informed, it's how trauma informed you are being. It's like a philosophy idea. And
Yeah.
that's something that, that's something I've carried with me, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also, there's so many well-intended things that are said, and it's just like, please don't paint me as a damaged person. Like,
Yes.
we are not a they, and so there's a lot of and it's tricky because you want to accumulate damages, but at the same time, I am a human and I am sitting here and I want to live my life. And so while you're saying all these things that are so messed up about me, like it's so hard to navigate. And so figuring out when to say those things and how to say those things, and if it's necessary, and navigating those waters, and just always being aware of it.
On that point, I'd like to add, I love what you're saying, Bridie, and this is something that I often bring up, where trauma-informed care becomes something that people put on a shelf and take off when someone discloses to them, right? And they're like, oh, yes, I would never say that if I knew someone was a survivor. And I say to them, how do you know? If you're saying things that are not trauma-informed in just your everyday life, in passing, in conversations around the coffee pot, when we get back to that after COVID lifts, right? But when we're in any space, even online, the things you're posting, the things you're commenting, survivors are watching all the time. And we are deciding whether you are a safe person to disclose to or not. So the idea is to assume that everyone we interact with is potentially a survivor. Our coworkers, our family members, our friends, and much less the people coming to us seeking services, and to have it with us all the time. Something we put on as we get dressed every day should be a lens of trauma-informed care.
Yeah, and I think it goes to a bigger conversation. It's Jackson Katz is someone who's amazing and has led this. It's kind of like the bystander effect, right? And so, if you see someone being beat up on the street, someone stops. But if you're playing a game of poker, guys are playing a game of poker with their friends, and someone says a sexist comment and everyone kind of awkwardly laughs, like, no, stand up and say something, and it's that same idea that it needs to be in this too, and it needs to be that, and also it's don't act differently around me because of this, like don't act differently because I was molested as a kid. Don't act differently because I like to skate in circles I still do, right? Like, so don't treat me differently for this. We're just all humans together, and we need to be able to stand up in those micro situations, and those are the ones that overall are going to make the difference. And so bringing it right back to this webinar, it's not when you go in and what is that piece of paper that you're giving the client, but it's like, who are you? What is the air like in your office? What does it feel like to be there? What does it feel like to be in a Zoom meeting with you? So it's a way of life. And like Laura said, it's not, oh, I need to give a shit today, I'm going to take the book off the shelf. Like, it's not like that. It needs to be who you are and the person you are.
Thank you. And thank you all for your expertise and your guidance. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll just have space for questions to come in as well. My final question is, Bridie, I know we've talked on this before. I am not a survivor, but I consider myself an advocate. I do what I can. There's a lot of attorneys in this space who may or may not be survivors themselves. What is some guidance you may give to advocates who are not survivors themselves, but want to do the best they can for survivors, recognizing they may make mistakes, but they're trying to do the right thing? Is there any guidance you would give to people who are specifically in that situation?
So on this call, to the people that are listening to this, I have a very specific answer to that. And the fact of the matter is that changing statute of limitation laws across this country is hard and it is expensive. The winnings that can come to the lawyers after the work is done is immense. We're seeing it in New York. Over 6,000 people have filed. But I quit my job in finance. I started a nonprofit. I ended up on Medicaid and qualifying for food stamps in order to put everything I had into passing that law. It shouldn't have to be that way. And so I think if, as a community, if we can come together, and if one person has $500,000 to put in, we can go and plow into a state and do some great stuff there. But if each person would look to their neighbor and look at these conferences and do that kind of thing and just put in $5,000, it, like the idea of just being a good person all day, every day, it will add up. And we have laws that are changing in Louisiana and Arkansas, but the one that just passed in Louisiana, not sure how great it's going to be. Massachusetts didn't eliminate the notice of claims. So while you'll have advocacy groups that just want to go and pin, I changed the law, change the law, change the law. If it's not good, what good does it do? Right? So we need to have the people that are frontline working there that are going to make sure that institutions are held accountable and that they can be held accountable. So to be honest, everyone on this call, I would say support us, support America Loves Kids and the work that we do, because it's going to pay dividends for you. At the flip side of that is 6,000 people filed in New York. We're still counting how many people in New Jersey, and every single day we get emails from survivors. So it's the most rewarding work that one can do. And so you help us pass the law so that we can then give you tons of cases. But honestly, we need help.
Regina, same question to you.
Is to do whatever you possibly can to support Bridie and America Loves Kids, because she over the past few years, she's not only been at the forefront in getting the law passed in New York State. She's gone to other states. She's gone to Arizona, which was quite a battle there. But with an organization like America Loves Kids, with Bridie at the helm, she's also learning about some mistakes that were made in previous laws that were passed, and is, taking that great knowledge and trying to make sure that's addressed either by having the laws amended or working towards having that law amended or having it expanded and applying it in other states as well. So it is critical to make sure if you're in this for all survivors everywhere across the U.S. And so that I'm just going to reinforce what Bridie said. The best thing you could possibly do is just write a check out or go online to America Loves Kids. There's a fantastic video, that you see with Bridie on the front. You learn a little bit more about it, but she has really been there at the forefront, across the nation. And then there's a lot more work to do.
I wasn't necessarily expecting that response. I do generally concur. Dr. McGuire, same question to you. What's one thing that you would tell advocates who may or may not be survivors themselves that they can do that make a difference?
Absolutely. I think, as we spoke to, it begins with doing the internal work and identifying areas that they need to grow in, both individually and for their firms and for their communities, their local bar association, going to them and saying, we need to have these conversations. And, for my firm, we do a lot of in-depth trainings, and we now are starting to certify people in trauma care for legal professionals. And what that does is, number one, it gives something forward-facing that survivors can identify and seek out attorneys who have invested that level of competency into this, much beyond the 101 that a lot of people have had some familiarity with, but they don't know, again, what it looks like actionably. And then it also gives accountability. If somebody works with that attorney and they say, they took the certification and they were not trauma informed with me, then we can go and have that conversation with them additionally and see where there's some problems there and hopefully address them. And if not, revoke that certification. So it really is about all of these things that everyone here is discussing, of supporting the nonprofit, supporting the many national organizations that fight for these legislative changes, doing the work yourself and in your community, and then investing in that education so that you aren't just saying, this is another nice idea, but this is something we're willing to walk the talk on, we're willing to put money behind and our time behind and dedicate our practice to.
Thank you so much. We haven't received any questions in the chat, but all of our attendees have stayed with us this entire time. So I want to thank you. I know we've been speaking for about 50 minutes. If you do have questions, please ask them now. And if not, I mean, I still have a long list of questions, and I'm appreciating all the guidance and advice as well. So I'll keep asking for the next 10 minutes, but I will certainly cut off if people have questions they have that they haven't had a chance to ask. So I work specifically around financial issues. At Milestone Consulting, we do our best to have a trauma-informed settlement planning practice. More than just throwing somebody into a structure, we actually build individualized plans, trusts, the whole 9 yards. If it comes to doing finances things for survivors, that's what we do. With all that being said, I know how hard it can be to talk around money and trauma, especially when the money is attached to the trauma. What kind of conversations or tips would you recommend to attorneys who are talking around high damages type cases that are directly related to the worst types of things you could imagine, right? I mean, no amount of money is ever worth it. And if somebody is seeing 7 figures for something they've been through, we all know that that's not something very typically viewed as very positive, right? And so how do you handle those conversations, and what kind of guidance could you give to attorneys who are having those conversations?
I'm going to take that question because then I have a hard stop at 3 o'clock. But so I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And before I dove into the world of advocacy, I worked in financial services, and I saw firsthand how people can be misled or taken advantage of, honestly, within the financial services. And so this is near and dear to my heart. As I thought about it more, I mean, the 2 kind of hardest things to talk about in our American society right now is sex and money, right? And this is a combination of them, if you're talking specifically about the child sex abuse world. And so it is an extremely hard conversation. And there is so much guilt connected to it and so much emotion connected to it. And what I think is so important is to be able to give the survivor time to just think, like just time. You know, it's like a broken bone. Even if it feels better, it just needs time. And so, I mean, that's personally why I partner with Milestone, is so that you all come in and you help the survivor, and you recognize that there's so many layers to this. There's so many things to think about. There's what are my financial needs right now? What do I want to do right now? Like, do I just need a break and to get out of here? What are my goals 20 years, 50 years from now? What's my, right? There's 100 different layers to it. And then again, like I said, that combination of the 2 of where did this money come from and how did I get it? And in cases like the Child Victims Act in New York, where I might be able to file a suit, but my neighbor can't, you know, that associated with it. And so I think what's so important is that lawyers kick ass at trying cases, at winning the cases, right? And then pass it off. My world has functioned much more in the medical world with my 10 orthopedic surgeries. And so like the lawyers to me are the surgeons, and right, they did that. Now it goes that post-op and that recovery. And so give all that to Milestone to just have to deal with and think about and let that wound heal. And it just needs time for that to settle out.
Well, thank you for the words of confidence. Again, I wasn't necessarily expecting that. I'll say use qualified settlement. Use qualified settlement funds, people, and thank you. It is what we specialize.
Not to have a filter, and I just speak from the heart. So that's the honest answer. I'm so sorry. I have to jump off. But
Bridie, thank you so much for joining us. You were amazing to have as a panelist. I hope we can do another one of these again.
Yes.
We will be sending out feedback to everybody, and people may have questions. I'll contact you if you're able to answer any of those.
Sure, and
so
share my email with anyone.
Now, let us know.
Bye all.
Sorry. Thank you, Bridie. Regina and Laura, I'd like to kind of pass the same question to you. If you have, either one of you can take it, whoever feels like they're.
Well, I'll jump in first. You know, as attorneys, we know that we shouldn't be practicing in an area that we don't have experience. And if we don't have experience in, you know, financial, you know, providing any kind of financial advice or you know, financial planning, we definitely should not be giving any advice on that. So it's always best just to recommend to your particular clients to speak to, you know, a variety of different financial planners so they could find someone that they're comfortable with. They would likely look to your recommendation on that. I always recommend giving more than one option, so at least they feel that they're not being sent to someone and, you know, have to go to that person. Recently, there's a scenario with a series of clients on a completely different matter, where you know, we recommended, myself and my co-counsel recommended his particular you know, financial advisor, and I actually did recommend Milestone, and and the reason why is because, you know, Milestone is a little bit different because they have a not-for-profit that was founded by John Baer and his wife, and it was founded around the time of 9/11 for the families at that particular point to at least get like a little bit of money. And what they do is they cap it out at $25,000, and the interest rate is much lower than so many other litigation funders that are out there, but it helps the family get a little bit of money. And the reason why they're capped out at $25,000 because they have money in there, but they want to do what they can to possibly help out as many people as possible. But while they're doing that, they're also providing free financial guidance to that particular client to prepare them for what it is that they want to do. And, you know, to get a little bit more information about them, you could see in the New York City Bar Association, when they were looking at litigation funders for plaintiffs, they actually talked about the Baer Foundation. And it is also an article from Law 360, which kind of did an analysis of the positives and the negatives of not only litigation funding, but also understanding, you know, providing, you know, your clients with these types of recommendations. So what I did is share with my clients the Law 360 article so they see the positive and the negative. Because if you're referring them to a financial consultant, a lot of them are providing this litigation funding, and then, you know, share with them a little bit about the not-for-profit too, but give them options. Don't just direct them in one direction. Give them options so they're the ones that are making that choice.
Thank you so much, and also for bringing up Baer's Foundation. So our nonprofit is probably the most important part of our practice. It's single-digit interest advances. You can imagine what it looks like to the rest of the industry, and we always prioritize these types of cases. They're the type of cases that are the easiest for us to fund, as they fit into what we're trying to do. I will add, the Baer's Foundation only provides funding for essential necessities. So that's like housing, shelter, you know, food, clothing. It's not to go buy a new car with. Our goal is to give people as little money as possible because we don't want them to accrue interest in debt. So the idea is that as much as their settlement as possible will go to them. But thank you so much. Again, I wasn't necessarily expecting that response, but I greatly appreciate it. I certainly believe in what we do, and it's awesome to see that you guys do too. Dr. McGuire, lastly, just to you, this will be our final question, but when it's talking about large amounts of money that is attached to trauma, what kind of guidance would you kind of give to attorneys?
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about money and trauma, it is such a delicate matter to navigate. And I think particularly living in a capitalistic society, we're so used to money being this ultimate goal, to being this prize, to being something that is potentially wiping the pain away and making everything right. And of course, we know that that is not the case in these situations, that it is often a huge help, but it is not a cure-all. It is at best a band-aid on the festering wound that is the pain that that person has experienced. So approaching your clients in that way and understanding, again, how sensitive this is, that this is not something, even if they had a very positive outcome, that this is not something they're ever going to be numb to or not have traumatic experiences and feelings and memories around. And so having that sensitivity, making sure that you understand in any form of trauma, the ultimate key issue was that power was taken away from that individual. And so you don't want to replicate that in how you're directing them with these funds or how you're speaking to them or pressuring them to fit, any kind of particular agenda or timeline, but really working with them as a partner to feel empowered that you are their guide on this journey. They are not there to, check your boxes and serve you. And I will echo too, definitely learn from Milestone Consulting, because you all have, but for example, doing this webinar today, the investment you've already made with training with me, with Bridie's nonprofit, with all these different people, you have an understanding that this really is your way of changing the world and your way of truly being in service of humanity. And that's the page you want everyone to get on. So, being that role model, if someone else is listening to that and they're saying, I'm in that space too, then be a role model for this and take these steps as well.
Well said. I mean, in our different bar associations, we all have the ability to impact change. Our law firms can, continue to push this forward, as I know many of our attendees are already doing, and I know everyone on our panel has certainly done. So I just want to have one more big thank you to everyone who participated today. Lastly, I just want to mention we do these about once a month, not always on this topic. I would love to get these panelists together in person at some point where we could do something similar and not have technical difficulties and COVID hanging over us like this. But at the same time, these conversations are important. Please bring them home to your law firms, to your dinner tables. We can create the change we want to see. We can be that change. I hope this was helpful. You'll be receiving an email following this webinar, and we will actually include within it a guide to some of the practice tips that were discussed, and just more links to resources and the like if any of the attendees are interested in pursuing that. Also, we're always available for questions. Milestone's easy to reach. My cell phone number's on the website, so just give me a call if you have questions regarding us. And I'm sure that Dr. McGuire, as well as Ms. Calcaterra and Ms. Farrell would all be happy to answer any of your questions as well. So thank you again for everyone for attending, and we are only 10 minutes over. So for me, that's a huge accomplishment. Anyways, thanks again, and I'll talk to everybody soon.
Thank you for having us.